They thought they could bully the dead until justice came knocking. A greedy HOA slapped massive fines on my deceased relatives, but their heartless scheme backfired spectacularly. Here's how the law made them pay for their cruelty. The first letter came 3 weeks after the funeral. It was addressed to my uncle who had passed away. The envelope looked official, with the HOA logo stamped in the corner. Inside was a notice about unpaid fines for violations on his property. The due date had already passed. Late fees were being added. I called the HOA office to explain the situation. The woman who answered sounded impatient. She said the fines would keep accumulating until they received a copy of the death certificate. I mailed it the next day. Week later, another notice arrived. This one warned that if the fines weren't paid, the HOA would place a lien on the property. I called again. This time, a different person told me the death certificate had been received, but the fines were still valid because the violations had occurred before my uncle's passing. I asked what violations they were referring to. The woman hesitated, then said the file didn't specify. She promised to look into it and call me back. She never did. The letters kept coming, each one more urgent than the last. Threats of legal action, liens, even foreclosure. All for a house, where no one lived anymore. I went to the HOA office in person. The manager, a man in a stiff-collared shirt, told me the system was automated and there was nothing he could do. I asked why they were charging fines for violations that were never documented. He shrugged and said it was standard procedure. I pulled out the latest letter, the one threatening foreclosure. I asked how an automated system could make legal threats without human approval. He didn't have an answer. That's when I started digging. I read through the HOA bylaws. I looked up state laws on probate and property rights. What I found was clear. The HOA had no legal standing to impose fines on a deceased homeowner's property while it was still in probate. They were breaking their own rules and the law. I went back to the next HOA meeting with copies of everything. I stood up during the open forum and asked the board to explain why they were harassing a dead man's family over violations that didn't exist. Room went quiet. One board member muttered something about paperwork errors. Another said they would look into it. I didn't wait for them to investigate. I filed a complaint with the state. I contacted a lawyer, and I made sure every neighbor in that subdivision knew what was happening. By the time it was over, the HOA had to reverse every fine. They had to send a written apology. And the property manager who shrugged at me? He didn't last much longer in that job. But the worst part wasn't the fines or the threats. It was realizing how many other families they had done this to. People who didn't know their rights. People who paid out of fear or grief. They thought they could get away with it. They were wrong. The letters never stopped. Every week, another envelope arrived, thicker, more official looking. The threats escalating. Late fees turned into legal warnings. Legal warnings became notices of lien. Then came the foreclosure notice. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the latest demand. The house was empty. The grass was overgrown because no one lived there anymore. The mailbox leaned slightly to the left because a storm had knocked it loose months ago. None of that had mattered when my uncle was alive, but now? Now it was a problem worth thousands of dollars in fines. I called the HOA again. This time, I recorded the conversation. The woman on the phone sounded tired. She recited the same lines. The fines are valid. The violations occurred before the homeowner's death. Payment must be made to avoid further action. I asked for proof of the violations. She put me on hold. When she came back, her tone had changed. The system shows violations for unapproved exterior modifications and failure to maintain landscaping. I laughed. There were no modifications. The house was exactly as it had been for 20 years. The landscaping, my uncle had paid the HOA's preferred landscaper every month until the day he died. I demanded documentation, photos, inspection reports, anything. She said she would email them. The email never came. That afternoon, I drove to the HOA office. The receptionist recognized me and sighed. The manager isn't available. I didn't leave. I sat in the lobby until he finally stepped out of his office. He tried the same excuses. It's an automated system. We don't control the fines. You'll need to take it up with legal. I pulled out my phone and played the recording. His face tightened. You can't fine a dead man for violations that don't exist, I said. And you can't threaten foreclosure on a house that's in probate. I've read the laws. Have you? He crossed his arms. If you have a problem, file an appeal. I already had. They denied it. That's when I realized they weren't going to stop. They didn't care about the law. They didn't care about the truth. They cared about money, and they thought I would eventually give in. I left the office and called a lawyer. 2 days later, the attorney sent a letter of his own. It cited state statutes, probate codes, and a recent court case where an HOA had been fined for similar predatory behavior. The HOA's response was immediate. Suddenly, the manager was very sorry for the confusion. The fines were under review. They would correct the error immediately. But it was too late for apologies. I wasn't just fighting for my uncle's house anymore. I was fighting for every family they'd bullied into paying fake fines. For every grieving relative who'd been too exhausted to push back, I filed a formal complaint with the state attorney general's office. I contacted the local news, and I made sure every homeowner in the neighborhood knew what the HOA had tried to do. The foreclosure notice was rescinded. The fines were wiped away, but the fight wasn't over. Because sometimes the only way to stop a predator is to make them regret ever targeting you in the first place. The HOA thought I would back down. They were wrong. I spent nights researching, digging through state statutes and court records. What I found was worse than I imagined. Their actions weren't just unethical, they were illegal. First, state law clearly prohibited HOAs from imposing fines or liens on properties in probate. The moment my uncle died, their authority over the property froze. Yet they'd continued sending demands for months. Second, their own bylaws required written notice of violations before assessing fines. I requested copies of these notices. They couldn't produce any. The violations had been invented after my uncle's death. Third, foreclosure laws strictly regulated how and when an HOA could initiate proceedings. They'd skipped multiple required steps, jumping straight to the most extreme threat. I compiled everything into a folder, certified copies of the death certificate, proof of probate filing dates, their threatening letters, records of my unanswered requests. For violation evidence, the state laws they'd violated. My lawyer's eyes widened as he reviewed it. This isn't just negligence, he said. This is a pattern. We discovered something even more disturbing. The HOA had done this before. Court records showed 3 similar cases in the past 5 years, all against elderly homeowners or heirs. Each time, the families had quietly paid rather than fight. The HOA's strategy was clear. Target vulnerable properties, deceased owners, out-of-state heirs, invent violations with no documentation, ramp up threats quickly, collect payment from those too grief-stricken or uninformed to resist. They'd perfected their predatory system. Automated letters created the illusion of legitimacy. By the time victims realized the demands were fraudulent, the HOA had worn them down. But this time, they'd picked the wrong target. My lawyer drafted a blistering legal notice outlining violations of state probate law, breach of HOA fiduciary duty, fraudulent misrepresentation, intentional infliction of emotional distress. We gave them 7 days to respond. The HOA president called me directly. His tone was completely different now, almost pleading. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said. "We're happy to waive all fines." I interrupted him. "This isn't about waiving fines anymore. It's about accountability." I could hear papers shuffling. On his end, what would it take to resolve this? Quietly? I hung up. The next day, their attorney responded with an offer. complete removal of all fines and liens, payment of my legal fees, a goodwill gesture payment. It was a start, but not enough. Because the real question remained: how many others had they victimized, and what would stop them from doing it again? I instructed my lawyer to add 2 non-negotiable terms: a full audit of all fines issued to deceased homeowners in the past 5 years, public disclosure of the audit results to all HOA members. The HOA resisted at first. Then the local news station called them for comment. Suddenly, they couldn't sign the agreement fast enough. As I reviewed their settlement offer, one detail stood out. Buried in the legalese was a stunning admission. Their own records showed at least 12 other questionable cases, 12 families, 12 shakedowns, and until I pushed back, they'd planned to make my number 13. The settlement agreement sat on my kitchen table, its pages filled with carefully worded legal terms. But what mattered most wasn't the language, it was the consequences. The HOA had to reverse every fine, every late fee, every threat they'd sent. They had to pay my legal costs. They had to issue a formal apology. And most importantly, they had to open their books. The audit revealed what I'd suspected. This wasn't an accident. It was a pattern. Over the past 5 years, they'd targeted nearly a dozen other properties, all belonging to deceased homeowners or grieving families. The violations were fabricated. The fines were baseless. And in every case, the HOA had pushed until someone paid. But now, the truth was out. The local news picked up the story. A reporter showed up at the next HOA meeting, camera in hand. The board members shifted in their seats, their usual confidence gone. When the floor opened for questions, neighbors stood up one after another demanding answers. Did you fine my mother's estate for a broken fence that was never broken? Why did you threaten to foreclose on the Johnson's house 2 weeks after Mr. Johnson died? Who approved these fake violations? The board president stammered through excuses, but no one bought it. The evidence was right there in the audit report, pages of predatory behavior, all signed off by the same people now claiming ignorance. Within a week, 3 board members resigned. The property management company fired their on-site manager. The HOA's attorney dropped them as a client, but the real victory came when the state attorney general's office launched an investigation. What started as a fight over one house had uncovered something much bigger. Other families came forward with similar stories. Some had paid thousands in fraudulent fines. Others had nearly lost their homes. The HOA tried to downplay it as procedural errors. The Attorney General called it what it was: a deliberate scheme to exploit vulnerable homeowners. Fines piled up, this time against the HOA itself. They were ordered to repay every dollar they'd taken, plus penalties. New oversight measures were put in place. The remaining board members were replaced in a special election. I drove by the HOA office the day the news broke. The blinds were drawn. The parking lot was empty. For years, they'd operated like they were untouchable. They'd bullied widows, harassed grieving families, and pocketed money they had no right to take. Now they were the ones facing consequences. And the best part? It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every family they'd wronged. Every person who'd been too afraid or too exhausted to fight back. The foreclosure threats stopped, the fake fines disappeared, and the house, my uncle's house, was finally left in peace. But I didn't stop there, because justice isn't just about fixing what happened. It's about making sure it never happens again. The first warning sign came when the HOA refused to provide documentation. The second came when they kept sending fines after receiving the death certificate. By the third threatening letter, I knew this wasn't just bureaucracy, it was a shakedown. Here's what I learned about fighting back. Document everything. Every phone call got recorded, where legal. Every letter was scanned and saved. When they claimed violations existed, I demanded proof in writing. Their inability to produce evidence became part of my case. Create a paper trail that includes certified mail receipts, dated copies of all correspondence phone, logs with names of who you spoke to, screenshots of online portal messages. Know the state laws protect homeowners, especially during probate. In my case, HOAs can't levy fines during probate proceedings. They must provide written violation notices with photographic evidence. Foreclosure requires multiple missed payments, not just fines. I printed relevant statutes and brought them to meetings. When they claimed authority, I cited the exact code they were violating. Go on the offensive. Instead of just defending against their claims, I filed formal complaints with the State Real Estate Commission requests for all HOA financial records. Sunshine. Law demands for meeting minutes. This forced them to spend time and money responding rather than harassing me. Mobilize neighbors. I discovered I wasn't alone. At the next HOA meeting, I handed out copies of the fraudulent fines against my uncle's property, the state laws being violated, instructions for filing complaints. Within weeks, 5 other families came forward with similar stories. Financial counterpressure when they threatened liens. I showed up at the bank that held their operating account with documentation of their illegal actions. Suddenly, their credit line was under review. When they needed to renew their insurance, the carrier asked uncomfortable questions about pending litigation. Legal leverage. My attorney sent a letter offering to settle for removal of all fines, payment of legal fees, board member resignations policy. Changes when they refused, we filed suit and notified the local media. The resulting publicity brought scrutiny they couldn't withstand. Preventive measures for others. Now I help neighbors. Record all HOA communications from day one, require photographic evidence for all violations, challenge fines in writing within the appeal window, attend board meetings, and demand transparency systemic reforms. After our case, the HOA was forced to implement third-party audits of all fines, mandatory violation documentation, grievance procedures for disputes, annual reviews of collection practices. The key lesson? HOAs rely on homeowners not knowing their rights. They count on people being too busy or intimidated to fight. But when you arm yourself with knowledge, document everything, and refuse to back down, the balance of power shifts dramatically. My uncle's house is now safely transferred to his heirs. The predatory board members are gone, and the new management thinks twice before sending questionable fines, because they know someone will make them prove every penny. That's how you turn defense into offense. That's how you protect what's yours. And that's how you make sure no other family has to go through what mine did.